First, I want to thank Sean and Luke Meddings for starting this ball rolling, and Christina, of course. I'm surprisingly not here to talk about dogma today, and as Sean said, this was meant to be a for and against argument for ELF, Robin being for ELF and me being anti-ELF. I said that it wasn't quite appropriate for me to do that, and watching Robin speak today, I'm actually really glad I didn't go up against you. Having said that, I will spend the first 30 minutes dissing ELF a little bit, so pardon me. But before that, let me start with an analogy. I'm from Singapore, and that means I'm from the outer circle. About 13 years ago, I came to England, and I used to live in a house share with about 7 people in the house. And as all house shares, you know, you get conflicts and issues with household chores. The very first conflict I had was me being over-enthusiastic, basically. I would wake up every morning and I would go into the living room area and greet everyone with a, "Good morning, everyone!" And I would get this blank stare. Now, if you think I'm a bit nuts now, you should have seen me 10 years ago. I was really nuts, right? So one day I was walking into the kitchen and I overheard someone saying, "That Chia, I can't trust her. She's over-enthusiastic. Something's really wrong with her. It's almost like she's fake." I was shocked ever since when did enthusiasm become a bad thing? And so I was really, really puzzled. Till one day, the rubbish needed taking out. And so I went up to my housemate, and in a very Singaporean accent, I said, "You take the rubbish out, cannot?" And he looked at me. And of course, then I heard, "Chia's really aggressive. It's all fake, this enthusiasm. She's really an aggressive person." So I went home into my room and I thought about it and I reformulated my sentence. This was pre-English teaching days, and I came back and I said, "Can you take the rubbish out, please?" Still aggressive. Thought about it a bit more, came back and said, "I was wondering if you can possibly take the rubbish out, please." For ages, I could not understand why they thought I was aggressive. And in a weird way, neither could they, because the ideas of what someone's personality, the ideas of what politeness is so ingrained inside us that it's really hard to put a finger upon what makes something polite or not polite. Is it really just simply linguistic? Now, I was furious when I came across ELF. There was a lot of mention about mutual intelligibility. Now, I'd spent about 7 years trying to change my accent, trying to stop having people say that I was aggressive. And then you tell me that, "Hey, your accent's all right, really. You know, you should pay attention to your roots. Why did you change your accent?" I was furious that people didn't understand why I had to change my accent, why I felt that I was being misunderstood, and I was sick of being misunderstood. So when ELFers or proponents of ELF started to say, "Hey, it's all about mutual intelligibility, nothing else," I was absolutely furious. Now, there were other issues I had with ELF. Perhaps it's just the rhetoric, but Jennifer Jenkins and her cohort kind of mentioned that it was unnecessary, harmful, and impossible for the non-native speaker learner to try and reach native speaker standards of ELF. And I found this perhaps slightly condescending. I was upset that they would think it's impossible for the non-native speaker. I know lots of non-native speakers who are expert users of English, who speak to me like native speakers. Another issue was this thing with identity and roots. There was a lot of discussion about this in the early days of ELF discussions, that one's roots and identities should be celebrated by maintaining your own accent. You should be proud. I should be proud to be Singaporean, and I should continue to speak like that. But if I speak like that, and then you say, "Excuse me, would you like some tea?" And I say, "I don't want, later very paiseh one no." Would you understand what I'm talking about? Can we still maintain mutual intelligibility if I insisted of maintaining my identity and roots? So, mutual intelligibility. In order to maintain mutual intelligibility, does this mean that we have to then codify ELF? Perhaps the Lingua Franca core is an example of the starts of codifying ELF, but why codify a variety when there already exists lots of varieties to pick from? Pick one. Teach American English, South African English, New Zealand English. Pick one. Why do you have to codify a new version? It's like Esperanto, which never really worked. Now, if we codify ELF, does that mean that we are codifying a dumbed-down version of English? Again, around the early ages of ELF discussions, Barbara Seidel-Hofer suggested perhaps some features that might be seen in ELF English, such as dropping the third person S, so saying I want, you want, he want, such as saying I want that you go instead of I want you to go, features such as dependent prepositions, saying we discuss about something instead of we discuss something. All right? And that, I think, led to a lot of outrage amongst practitioners, thinking that, is this what you codify, a dumbed-down version of English? Is this what we're supposed to teach? If students ask, are we supposed to then teach I like, you like, he like, and not he likes? What are the pedagogic implications of ELF? The issue that I kept thinking about was the impressions that you were making. It's not just about being intelligible. It's not just about communicating transactional meaning. What about phatic communication? What about the impression that you were creating of yourself in a job interview, for example? A lot of learners of mine often say that, yeah, you could express yourself in English, but can you translate your personality into the language? Can you make the same jokes and create the same impressions in a foreign language? That was really difficult for them. Now, I recently quit smoking. But as an ex-smoker, I used to stand outside the school having a cigarette with my colleagues. And occasionally you get students from the other school opposite us or our school coming to us and going, lighter, or fire. I used to get kind of irritated. I was thinking, I hope these are not my students, because my students would be saying, I don't suppose you have a lighter, do you? Or I was wondering if you could possibly lend me your lighter. So I started going around teaching students to say, could you plus bare infinitive, would you mind plus ing. I was wondering if you could possibly plus bare infinitive, blah, 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 because I did not want them to come across as rude. Having said that, in an ELF scenario, if a Korean a Korean businessman meets a Peruvian businessman, whose politeness rules should they follow? Should we follow the Korean way or the Peruvian way? Or what if the Korean did some research on the Peruvian way and tried to follow the Peruvian way, while the Peruvian did some research on the Korean way and tried to follow the Korean way, and they were just both, misunderstanding each other? Or should they follow the English way, because clearly English originated in England, so you've got to follow the English way? Or should it be the American way, because America's Hollywood and the internet and what have you has dominated the universe, so we should follow the American rules of politeness, shouldn't we? Or is there a third space that Cramsch talks about that occurs when these two are in interaction? Complicated, very confusing. I was confused, and so I decided to embark on my research into politeness. What is politeness? Now, the layperson would immediately say politeness equals minding your P's and Q's. If that's the case, then simply teaching students to say please, thank you, and excuse me would suffice. However, the definitions of politeness seem to vary from country to country, culture to culture. So in traditional IH standards, let's do some pair work. Right, here are some definitions of politeness. With the person beside you, do you think you could categorize them as definitions given by the Japanese, the English, or the Greeks? Let me do the first one as an example. Friendliness. Whose definition of politeness might that be? The Japanese, the English, or the Greeks? Absolutely, the Greeks. Okay, could you do the rest with your partner? Go. All right. So, everyone. Ooh. If friendliness was Greek, what is respect? Anyone? That was actually the Greeks in the research by Sofianou. Appropriacy? Japanese. It was Japanese. Formality? Japanese and English. And how about this one? A lot of politeness research, as you might know, done by Brown and Levinson, Leach, et cetera, were mainly done in a sort of very Anglo-centric context. And because of that, there seems to be also an association with directness and politeness. If you are direct, you are more or less polite. Less polite, and the more indirect you are, the more polite you are. However, strangely, the Chinese, the Russians, do not actually make a correlation between directness and politeness at all, which was quite curious. Now, we can't talk about politeness without talking about Brown and Levinson. Brown and Levinson talked about face borrowed from the very Chinese concept of preserving face in front of the public. I won't go into it into detail, but I'm sure you've come across it at some point. Face is the public self-image that every member of society wants to claim for himself. A bit like us putting our profiles up on Facebook in many, many ways, how we want to be seen. When we talk about face-threatening acts. Sorry about the picture. Request by nature is a face-threatening act for the person making the request because you could possibly reject me. It is also a face-threatening act for the person receiving the request because I have to reject you, but I don't want you to lose face and I don't want myself to lose face in the process. So it's a really delicate situation. Yeah? And so therefore, every interaction really is about a mutual maintenance of face. Now, because most of the research done was very Anglo-centric, there was a lot of talk about dividing linguistic politeness into levels of directness. Now, the most direct, bold, on record type of request would be something like, "Oi, take the rubbish out." The conventionally indirect request would be, "You wouldn't mind taking the rubbish out, would you?" Or, "Could you take the rubbish out? I was wondering if you could take the rubbish out." Followed by an unconventionally indirect, off-the-record request such as, "Oh, the bin is so full. I should really take it out, but oh, my poor back. Hint, hint, hint." And then you offer to take the rubbish out. Being mostly expert users and native speakers, what do you think people might consider more polite? The conventionally indirect or the unconventionally indirect? It's interesting that a lot of English native speakers considered the conventionally indirect request more polite than the conventionally indirect. But a lot of research shows that non-native speakers who did sort of sentence completion tasks and discourse completion tasks thought that this was more polite than this. Now, yes?
You could also say text.
Pardon me?
You could say the intonation.
Oh, yes.
Leading, it comes over.
Thanks for mentioning that. I have to clarify that because of the scope of the research, it was very hard for me to deal with pronunciation and pragmatics and lexical grammar all at the same time. So I did kind of try and exclude pronunciation from the equation, which all fell into place because Robin did all the pronunciation work today. But in my research, I decided to exclude pronunciation and have a look at the pragmatics of politeness between non-native speaker and non-native speaker. So we all know that a native speaker might think that lighter is rude. How about the non-native speaker? Would they perceive the same, have the same values as to how politeness is realized? So my context, voila, International House London. The reception. Now, the reception of International House London, although situated in a native speaker country, I found to be a really perfect ELF scenario because this is a place where all your non-native speakers got together. Half of our receptionists are not native speakers, but they're expert users of English, and so you often have a Japanese reception staff speaking to an Italian person who just walked off the street asking for directions, for example. Now, step one, I placed a dictaphone at reception with the permission of everyone involved and recorded an entire day's worth of requests. I then transcribed the requests that were intelligible, and I had 49 of them. This was followed by a questionnaire survey. So from 49 requests, I took 10 that I thought represented the 49. I re-recorded them again in one accent and one voice so that the respondents of the survey were not responding towards accents, but the request itself. I then carried out a questionnaire survey with 111 people, including reception staff, students, teacher trainees, and teachers of International House, but most of them, 99 of them, were non-native speakers. I then ignored the native speaker responses. This was then followed by interviews and focus groups, where I would sit with them with my dictaphone and recorded 8 focus groups and 6 interviews. The one-to-one interviews were with the reception staff. So reception staff had one-to-one interviews, mainly because they were the main receivers and they knew the context best. And I really wanted to know how they perceived the request. The others, with the students, the teacher trainees, etc., were done with focus groups. And then I transcribed all the interviews and focus groups. Shall we have a look at the requests? Now, sorry, let me just get through this. This is the questionnaire I gave them. It's really small, I don't expect you to see it. But what was interesting was my original questionnaire had direct, not so direct, indirect. And I found that a lot of respondents couldn't answer whether something was direct or indirect because being direct could be perceived as positive or negative. So the positive side of being direct is being clear and to the point. And the negative aspect of being direct is coming across abrupt and really forward and aggressive. So I divided it up, and this was the questionnaire they received. What kind of requests do you think we received? Do you think we heard any of the would you mind plus ing? Or I was wondering? How many I was wondering if you could possibly do you think I heard? None. How many do you mind or would you mind do you think I heard? Most of the requests, surprisingly, started with, I want, including the native speaker request, which started with, I just want. Who do you think used excuse me more? Native speakers or non-native speakers? Non-native speakers. Who do you think used greetings like hello and hi more? Native speakers. Now, I say this with only 49 requests, so clearly there is no empirical evidence in 49 requests, but it was just an interesting sort of observation. Let's look at some of them. Hope this works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play you 6 of the requests, and after which you're going to look at them again and discuss with your partner how you perceive them. Do you think they were seen as polite, impolite, and why? Okay.
Excuse me, the director, Maria? Director, Maria?
Now, this was a student an ex-student who approached reception asking for a director called Maria. Now, I've changed everybody's names to Maria, so for anonymity and all that. And has just approached reception. She wants to see an ex-director of the school called Maria, and she's just said, Director, Maria?
Excuse me, I want to cancel the IELTS, and Maria, he wants.
She wants.
Oh yeah, she wants.
I don't believe that's possible.
You can ask the IELTS office, yeah? Yeah, change to Maria.
Right, visitor, V for visitor, came to the IELTS, the reception and decided that she wants to change her IELTS preparation class. Her friend, X, called Maria as well, has come with her because V, wants to be in Maria's class. Receptionist then says, I don't believe that's possible. Visitor continues to say, you can ask the IELTS office, change to Maria's class. Yeah.
Excuse me, can I know my result for IELTS entrance exam? I'd like to have information about an advanced level because I'm reading economics, business and economics, and I need to improve my English. So I don't know if I need a specific exam in business or in general. I don't know my level, if I can do this test or not. I booked the IELTS course for the 11th of June, but I didn't get the information paper. Hello, I cannot find my name on...
Okay. What's your student number? Let me check.
All right, I'm going to go back and let's have a look at visitor 1 and visitor 2 again. Let me remind you, this was visitor 1 and visitor 2. Oh. If you think visitor 1 and 2 were considered polite or impolite by the questionnaire respondents and then by the focus group and interviewees, what do you make of these interactions? All right, everyone. So, what do you think? Visitors 1 and 2 rated polite, not so polite, or very impolite? Alistair, what do you think?
We thought they didn't sound that rude. I mean, it's difficult because you have to take the context into account as well. But then she does say, excuse me, in class. Before, she did say, something like Maria, director, Maria.
Oh, that was another student, yeah, the visitor 1, yep. So visitor 2 sort of starts off quite polite, wouldn't you say? But then what happens? Estelle?
What happens is that there's a problem and you're kind of on the spot, so probably
They forgot about being polite. Yeah, when it gets to this bit where she goes, I don't believe that's possible, and the visitor insists and goes, hey, you know, why don't you ask your boss, the IELTS office? You have no right to make decisions. You ask the IELTS office, all right? And that becomes kind of suddenly impolite, doesn't it? Like, whoa, you're overstepping your boundaries here. Which kind of suggests that perhaps politeness is not about single expressions or words like excuse me, but it's something that is negotiated in an interaction. Our opinions of people change as we interact. If you look at visitor 1 one more time, is it an issue of him or her being impolite? Or is it because they just don't have the language to express it? Now my question is, who would be harder on this visitor? A native speaker respondent or a non-native speaker respondent? I mean, I'm generalizing here, but why? Think about that. Now have a look at visitor 7 and visitor 6. Now let's look at visitor 7 again. Excuse me, can I know my results of the IELTS entrance exam? Pretty straightforward request, wouldn't you say? Yeah. The use of excuse me followed by the formulaic can I know plus noun. Visitor 6. I'd like to, much more polite than I want, and then grounding the request with a reason for the request. I'm reading economics, blah, 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 blah. Polite, impolite? Not so? Now, according to the questionnaire survey, visitors 1 and 2, which you saw earlier, were rated most impolite. Visitors 5 and 6, 7 and 6, which you're seeing now, were rated most polite. But if you look at the difference between 6 and the one before that, which was simply that, there was a clear difference between what people might consider polite or not polite. Is it because that visitor 6 grounds the request and therefore seems more friendly and conversational? How about these two? With your partner, what do you make of these two? Polite, impolite? Why? All right, so visitor 3 doesn't actually use any formulaic expressions for requests at all. In fact, it's a very unconventionally indirect request because they don't really state what the request is. They don't really tell you what they want the receptionist to do. They just state their condition and their situation. I didn't get the information paper, so what are you going to do about it? Polite, impolite? It's hard, isn't it? And that's interesting, isn't it, that without any requests available in visitor 3, that we could get sort of the intentions behind what they're really, really saying. Politeness is much more than just words, isn't it? Number 4 was really interesting. Now, earlier I talked about the correlation between abruptness and clarity. And I said that if you were direct, you're likely to be clear but abrupt. Now, if you look at all the 111 results of the questionnaire survey, which I analyzed with SPSS, if anyone's interested, there was absolutely no positive correlation between what was perceived as clear and what was perceived as abruptness. It was completely unrelated. However, if you look at visitor 4, there was actually a negative correlation between clarity and abruptness. In other words, what I'm saying is people who thought that this was a clear request. Does anybody know what visitor 4 wants? Is it clear to you? What's on the notice board? Is it because all of you work for IH? Yes, we have a notice board, and it tells you which class you're going to at the beginning of every month. And the student's clearly pointing to that and going, I can't find my name on there. And students of IH, trainees of IH who had been there for more than a month, clearly found this a clear comment and therefore didn't think it was abrupt. Those that had been in the school for just a week and had no idea what this was talking about and therefore circled very unclear also thought it was very abrupt. So there was a negative correlation between what was clear and what was abrupt. Very fascinating. Now, in the interviews and focus groups, I just collected all this wonderful data that I really, really just had to share with you. I'm just going to put them up. These are quotes from the transcripts that I think are quite self-explanatory, and I'm going to read them to you because they're fascinating. So one of the students said, I should say, excuse me, can I, could I? This is the first thing you can learn or do when you go to another country. So the student clearly understands the importance of adapting. That in Spain you might just say 1 beer please, but in England perhaps you need to say, can I have a beer please? This is a reception staff, and they said, okay, I think it's the whole manner in which they approach you. It's not just the words, it's whether they say excuse me, but it's also the expression, the intonation of course, and gestures, their facial expressions, etc., the body language. The student says, maybe at first I transferred a lot of things from my behavior in Brazil, but here I started to adapt. It's not that I was not polite in Brazil and now I'm polite. No, it's just that here you use just different ways to get there. Having said that, very recently at the BSIC conference in Dubrovnik, Sabrina, who has wonderfully done a PhD in intercultural communication, has found out that some things about politeness are so ingrained within us that you could teach students to say, I don't suppose you have that, do you? It's just not in them to use it. It just doesn't feel right. Similarly, if I go to Spain, I say, puedo haber una cerveza, por favor, and they all look at me like I'm nuts. I just can't bring myself to say, oi, una cerveza. I can't do it. This is one of the reception staff who said, it's actually very hard, especially with different cultures. They do tend to use words, not whole sentences sometimes, and that itself can be more aggressive. But you know the culture, and you know they don't mean aggression. You take that into account, and yes, then you don't consider them to be particularly rude, which suggests that perhaps knowing intercultural communication and knowing other cultures does help. Your awareness of other cultures does help you to give people the benefit of the doubt. I feel like I'm on 24 or something, like Kiefer Sutherland's going to just burst in. A student said, you have to understand that you are people with different cultures. You are, and you have to try and find balance between all the cultures so you can relate to each other, talk, and understand without having any problems. And of course, you might say that International House students in London are used to a multilingual environment where they are constantly meeting people from different countries, and they have that benefit of that. Perhaps if we're teaching in a more monolingual environment, it might be worth spending some classroom time talking about these issues and raising awareness of the different strategies of realizing politeness that might not always be homogeneous. Now, this student here is very perceptively saying, I know this person's learning English and understand where he's coming from. And surprisingly, each of the focus groups I did, every single one of them talked about this without any prompting from me at all. They all talked about the difficulty in being a non-native speaker and the difficulty in expressing politeness and your own personality in a foreign language. And because they understood that, they gave that person the benefit of the doubt, which I call the principle of charity. This student demonstrates the principle of charity really well by saying, so you're already a bit nervous because of the surroundings. You've just arrived here, so it might be that in the exciting, you might lose control of the structures you've learned or whatever. So I would understand that. In a conversation, I think being clear of what you want is the most important thing, because I can have a little knowledge of English, but knows exactly what I want to say, even if I don't make a sentence and everything, but to show that I need some help. Now, earlier, I was sort of criticizing ELF proponents for focusing on mutual intelligibility. I said that mutual intelligibility was clearly different from phatic communication. Impressions matter too, but the student was clearly telling me that you can't separate them both. Intelligibility is part of the impression that you are making. And perhaps in a foreign language, you're struggling so hard to understand that person and being intelligible yourself that really the rest of it just falls to the wayside. Now, yes?
Well, I take
Thanks for asking that. The questionnaire survey, we did the questionnaire survey first, and we followed on straight into the focus groups and interviews. The opening question was always, how did you answer on the questionnaire survey? What made you decide if somebody was abrupt or polite or appropriate? That was my opening question, and I would just let them run with it, dogma style. This was a reception staff saying this, and I was actually really emotional when he said it. Let me read it to you. If they are non-native speakers, I can understand what they want. You know, I don't mind using perfect, polite way of, you know, expression. Now, this is a non-native speaker speaking. When a non-native speaker, they don't tend to look down on you. I feel more confident if I speak to non-native speakers because usually their English is quite basic. I just give some time to express themselves, but if smiling and very, very friendly, even if they don't use formulaic, polite language, I'm very willing to help. And this summarizes it really well. If you don't speak the language yourself as a native speaker, you can't expect the other person to speak better than you do. You see what I mean? When you're not native and the other is not native, you should not expect much from him or her. Not in a bad way, but you know. And perhaps it's also about adapting and accommodation strategies that being a non-native speaker themselves are more able to use because of their mutual sympathy. Now, aside from linguistic features as well, you know, there's intonation, as I mentioned with the rubbish example. And I think this might warrant a whole research on its own of what might universally be perceived as polite intonation and what's not polite. Interestingly, the Singaporean intonation that I used when I was asking my housemates to take the rubbish out, there was this research done by Fitzpatrick in Asia about the Southeast Asian accents. And although most native speakers from America and England thought the Singaporean accent to be staccato-like, abrupt, and almost aggressive, none of the Southeast Asian counterparts thought that. They all thought it was just a clear accent. They didn't equate putting the stress on the last syllable, can you take the rubbish out, please, as being rude. Then there are other factors, other situational factors, the context, such as the attitude of the other person. If the other person's like, tell me quickly because I've got lots of work to do, then people is more nervous and they don't have the time to say please or other thing, and could be sound rude and could be influence the other person. Interactions are a two-person thing. It takes two. You could come in being really polite, and if the receptionist is really rude to you, you might switch. You can't examine utterances on their own. This is my favorite analogy. This reception member of staff, who was a non-native speaker, said, the bigger the favor, the more polite you need to be, and also the more, shall we say, unrelated the question is to the business, you need to be more polite again. So if you go to a hot dog stand and ask for a hot dog, then you don't have to be very polite, do you? If you have a request which is not directly related, like, do you know where the nearest underground is, could you please, then you need to be more polite than asking for the hot dog. Isn't it a wonderful analogy? So, what is politeness? Can we pinpoint it down to just linguistical items saying excuse me and please? Really, it is a multifactorial construct. It includes things we've mentioned like an awareness of other cultures and knowing that they could possibly have different strategies to realizing politeness and different definitions of politeness from us. It includes intelligibility that I was kind of doubting in the first place. Identity that's constantly being negotiated in interaction. The visitor who came in sounding polite, wanting to change her IELTS class, and then suddenly sounding more and more rude as she goes along because she was challenging the receptionist's authority. And then there is Brown and Levinson's PDR, which considers the power differences between the two. Perhaps the student comes from a culture that finds receptionists sort of a lowly job, perhaps. Or maybe the student comes from a culture that finds receptionists to be a really respectable job, and that might influence the way they approach the receptionist with their requests. Distance makes a difference, the distance in the PDR. Maybe the student has been in an international house for a year and knows the receptionist particularly well because they chat every day and therefore doesn't feel the need to be particularly polite. Yeah? Interaction is constantly changing, it's dynamic, it's fluid, and we can't possibly take one or two utterances out and examine them on its own. It includes linguistic features, paralinguistic features, non-linguistic features, gestures, tone of voice, etc. And we must not forget that when non-native speakers speak to each other, there is a principle of charity happening. I know you're a non-native speaker, so I forgive you, or I give you the benefit of the doubt, that white birth. So I will not judge you, because perhaps you're like me, and we don't intend to make the impressions that we end up making. I used to do this with my class constantly, showing them the difference between, no, don't applaud. The difference between saying, could you applaud please, to, I was wondering if you could possibly applaud. A lot of course books do this. And then students go, teacher, what's the difference between can you and could you? And you instinctively say, could you is more polite, or could you is more formal. Is it really? Can we take that out of context and say could you is more formal than can you? Can we take that out of context and say that I was wondering if you could possibly is really more polite? What if a wife says to her husband, darling, I was wondering if you could possibly tell me the directions to the tube station again? Is she really being polite, or is she just being ironic? So perhaps when discussing politeness in the classroom, we need case studies. We need discussions that raise awareness of issues like what is the context? Who are the people? What's the relationship between the two people interacting? What image do you want to portray? Do you want to be seen as distant but polite? Do you want to be seen as friendly and a bit mad like me? How do you want to try and achieve this? Playing them excerpts of interactions like the ones you've heard between my visitor and the receptionist, and using them as case studies. Asking students, what do you think of these people speaking? Why do you feel that way? And getting that conversation going between them. So let's review those issues I had with ELF that I mentioned at the beginning. Now, I complained that ELF was condescending to its learners because of the quote that learning to speak like a native speaker is unnecessary, harmful, and impossible. Perhaps I misunderstood Jenkins a little bit, because we're not talking about native speaker targets and native speaker English being better than ELF English. We're talking about two completely different threads of English. I love Robin's example of the ballroom dancer versus the break dancer, and that's exactly what it is. It's a different learning continuum, and perhaps often talking about interlanguage and L1 interference isn't so useful in terms of second language acquisition, because there are uses of English that our learners use English for that we can't do. Things like translation, things like code switching, that perhaps needs more place in the language classroom. The other issue I had with ELF was the Tower of Babel issue. That being a Singaporean, if I said to you, no la, I don't want your tea la, very paiseh one, you're not going to understand me. But then again, in reality, which Singaporean will say that to a person who doesn't speak Singlish? We would code switch, because when I'm speaking to my fellow Singaporean friends in Singlish, I would say that, but in front of a British person, I might just say, oh, I wouldn't possibly want to trouble you, sorry about that. Which essentially was what that meant. And so perhaps in the classroom, let's stop obsessing about whether we should teach dropping the third person S or whether we should be teaching dependent prepositions. That's not the point. The point is we should be teaching students to accommodate, to adapt, to learn, to code switch when necessary, to learn to suss out their interlocutor's level of English and adapt accordingly. Perhaps that's a skill that we ought to be teaching. Now, I was really against this whole idea of ELF being codified and the Lingua Franca core, but that is so passé, because if you read ELF literature, we are so past the idea of whether ELF is a variety or not a variety. At the end of the day, every ELF scenario is different. Every ELF community is different. The Southeast Asian ELF community have their own ELF, whereas the Finnish, Scandinavian ELF community have, again, a different ELF. We can't put them all together and call them one variety. So perhaps we should be focusing on how we negotiate meaning. Back to adaptation, accommodation. How do we get together and negotiate so that we mean what we want to mean? ELF, is it a dumbed down version of English? Or is it just a different type of English altogether? Perhaps we are not saying that we should teach students I like, you like, he like. Perhaps what we're really saying is, if students make a mistake and say he like play basketball, maybe we should just leave it alone. Because if the student's coming for class 2 hours every week, there's a lot more things that we can do with those 2 hours than focusing on the third person S. And is intelligibility at risk of sacrificing impressions? Or is it just one of the multiple constructs that builds impressions? I wonder if I had lived in that house share with 7 people, I wonder if I had lived with non-native speakers, if they might have been a lot more forgiving of my abrupt staccato-ish intonation when asking them to take the rubbish out. Or perhaps I'm just an aggressive person. Thank you very much. This is